Hello and welcome to the 7th of 8 presentations in the 2021 Great Decisions Lecture Series. My name is Matthew Hughes and I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council in Kansas City, and we're so glad to have you with us today. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. We invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other upcoming events, information on joining a Great Decisions group, and how to join the IRC as a member on our website at irckc.org. For decades, the annual Great Decisions Briefing Book has framed informed civil discussions about critical international issues. Groups around the country, including here in the Kansas City metro area, meet in coffee shops, conference rooms, and now virtually to explore these issues together and distill policy recommendations and future outlooks. To support their exploration and to bring the larger community into the discussion, the International Relations Council is proud to offer a series of conversations with respected experts through 2021 on the year's 8 Great Decisions topics. We warmly welcome diverse perspectives and invite your engagement with these foreign policy issues from work, from home, or wherever you might be. We hope you'll engage that way with us today as we explore global supply chains and national security. We know that many in the audience have already discussed this topic with their local Great Decisions group. So we certainly welcome your thoughtful questions through the course of the conversation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And do check out and share the other conversations in this and other lecture series as we consider a range of critical foreign policy issues in the coming months. We're very grateful to our sponsors who have made this evening's program and the Great Decisions lecture series possible. In particular, thanks to sustaining series sponsors Cyprian Simkowitz and Jerry White, and supporting series sponsor Nancy C. Messer. We also greatly appreciate the support of Global Conversation sponsor, the Greater Kansas City Foreign Trade Zone. Learn more about their work at gkcftz.com. Thank you so much for finding value in these conversations. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's program, who will introduce our speaker and help us to navigate the conversation. Francisco Martinez is NASCO's representative in Mexico. He's been actively involved in NASCO's activities in Mexico since 2006. He is a native of Monterrey and has a degree in mechanical engineering from Monterrey Tech. Francisco lived in Kansas City actually for 10 years, where he obtained an MBA here from Baker University and studied international business at UMKC. His professional experience includes topics as varied as quality assurance, production planning and management, international procurement, international logistics, as well as business development in Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, Middle East, China, and so many other places. Francisco is the founder of 2 companies in Monterrey, and we are so grateful to have him with us this evening. Francisco, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Please take it away.
Thank you, Matthew. It's an honor to be with you, and I am thrilled to be part of the international scene in Kansas City again. It's been a while, so thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for everybody attending this talk. I would like to introduce to you a very interesting person, very important person here in Mexico, Guillermo Malpica. Guillermo has a long and distinguished career in Mexico Ministry of Economy. In October, he was designated to represent the Ministry of at the Embassy of Mexico in Washington, D.C., October of last year. And Guillermo has served as Mexico Director General for International Trade in Services and Investment in Mexico Ministry of Economy since 2008. Since then, he has been instrumental, actually, in formulating Mexico's position in these areas in multilateral, regional, and bilateral fora, including, for example, the Doha Round in the World Trade Organization, the OECD, ALADI, APEC, TISA, and the Pacific Alliance and the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the TPP. Guillermo currently is serving in the Ministry of Economic Development of the state of Puebla. And without further ado, I would like to introduce formally Guillermo Malpica. Guillermo.
Thank you very much, Francisco, for the introduction, and thank you, Matthew, and the IRC for the invitation for this talk. I'm very glad to be at least virtually with you in Kansas City, and ready to engage in a very fruitful and interesting discussion with you.
Guillermo, would you like to start your presentation?
Yeah, I wanted to start by mentioning a few topics with respect to the issue of value chains, global value chains in the current world. We have been experiencing. Let me put it in Mexico's perspective. Although I no longer work for the federal government, I was part of the negotiating team from Mexico for a number of years, and I was witness of the effort of Mexico to build a network of FTAs precisely to have the opportunity to offer companies established in Mexico several options for their purchases of inputs, basically. So they were able to buy with preferential treatment into Mexico imports coming from a number of countries from all around the world. And that was the way the world was working previously, with these global value chains extended throughout several continents. You could build a specific product, bringing components from different regions of the world. That was the offshore practice that was very common before the COVID pandemics. After the crisis brought by the pandemics and the closure of several borders, several companies that were very much established that way suffer from the lack of inputs, suffer from the lack of specific components that basically were stopping their production process. And that's where we are now. No? We are now in the end, hopefully, of this very unique situation in the world, and we are experiencing a different trend. Let me put it this way: a different trend in world trade, which is basically the narrowing or the trend to bring supply chains shorter in terms of geographic location. So what we are experiencing, instead of having an offshoring practice for companies established globally, we're experiencing more like a regional concentration of the global of the previously global supply chains. So now we are experiencing more like a regional supply chain, and the trend to rely on suppliers which are nearer than before. So we are talking about nearshoring as a practice for companies. Still, the practice of having FTAs all around the world is useful, but I think we have to be analyzing this economic and trade policy from a different perspective, from the perspective of a different configuration of trade and trade flows. And of course, we can talk about other issues that are also affecting the way trade is made today, as the trade war between the US and China, how this affects Mexico. I mean, we can talk a lot about different other factors affecting trade flows in North America, basically. But I would mention those, and of course, the new protectionist wave among countries from the WTO. The WTO is monitoring constantly new measures from members, together with the G20 countries, and they have been observing an increase in protectionist measures from countries as a result of the COVID pandemics, but also as a result of the new configuration of trade flows, and also as a result of the economic crisis that some countries are facing as a result of the COVID times. So a number of issues basically interacting together to make a different scenario for trade flows. I would like to start with this as an introduction, and if you wish, Francisco, we can start, developing different topics with respect to this very broad and interesting, and of course very important movements of the trade arena.
Absolutely, Guillermo. And by the way, if you hear that I call Guillermo Memo, it's just a term of endearment. That's okay. All right, Memo. I would like to, we know that the US, Canada, and Mexico are dependent on trade with each other. To what extent do you think that is? And could you tell us a little bit about the difference, since you were in the negotiations, between the NAFTA, the previous free trade agreement that we had, and then the USMCA that happened during the Trump administration? Can you give us a little your perspective on that, please?
Yes, of course, and apologies because some dogs are really barking very loudly near my house. But that's part of the new reality of working from home. Trade dependence among North American countries is very, very high. We can see that because throughout 25, 26 years, we were able to have increasing flows of trade and investment, and as a result of that, we no longer export or import to each other. We basically produce together for the world markets. So we have a very high level of integration in some sectors. The main one being the automotive and auto parts sector, where basically a car can cross several times the two borders of North America in order to have a car finished. I mean, we have counted something like 8 crossings in order to have a car completed. And from every dollar that Mexico exports, for instance, to the world, something like 40 cents are made of inputs coming from the US. So in a way, when Mexico exports, the US is exporting and vice versa. So the level of integration is unique in that sense, higher than in other regions of the world. And we have a flow of trade that is impressive. I mean, we are basically now adding up to more than $1 million of bilateral trade between Mexico and the US, for instance, every minute. So 1 million, a little bit more than $1 million every minute. As we speak, we have more than $1 million trade between Mexico and the US, more than 4 million crossings every year through the border. We have perhaps one of the most active borders in economic terms in the world. So that tells a story about the level of integration that we have as a region. And of course there were big differences between the negotiation of the original agreement, the NAFTA of 1994, and the new agreement, the USMCA. The main difference is that for the first time in the history of the three countries were not seeking the same. I mean, in NAFTA times, the three countries were seeking a free trade area where the three countries were going to grow together, and competitiveness was understood from the regional point of view. In the USMCA negotiation, on the other hand, we had the US basically seeking to balance trade. President Trump was worried about trade deficits with Mexico and Canada, and also trying to bring back investments that were that in the previous years moved to Mexico or to Canada. trying to bring those investments back to the US. So those were the drivers of the negotiation for the US at the beginning, and for Mexico and for Canada. We were not seeking a renegotiation at the very beginning. So we were invited, let's put it that way, to start negotiating. And then when we started that, we decided that it was a good opportunity also to modernize an agreement 25 years old. So big differences, and of course big differences in terms of the scope of the agreement. We have 10 more chapters than the original agreement, and of course the dynamics of the negotiation was completely different, very hostile sometimes and very complex, of course.
Yeah, I'm sure that was the case, and I like the way you put it, Memo, that we're not actually trading with each other, we're actually producing together. I like that. And of course, with that brings the subject of the supply chain, which is right now very stressed, as you know. I mean, you and I deal with this kind of stuff every day, and we know that the situation with the supply chain, not only internationally, but even domestically in the three countries, is kind of difficult. So how do you think we could have prepared better as the North America bloc for this COVID situation? Because I'm sure there were some things, as they say, hindsight is 20/20. So what do you think we could have done better to prepare for this situation? And what do you see in the future for the supply chain? Do you think we'll recover pretty soon, or is this something that's going to stay for a while?
I will start for the second question, and I think that's a very, very good question, and probably nobody has the right answer to that, because it's very unpredictable. It's depending on a number of factors, internal factors, which are basically related to the national endowments of different factors of materials and labor and productivity, but also depending on a number of external factors that are beyond our control. No, we saw in the very few months crisis of containers. We saw an accident in the Suez Canal, and we saw a number of practices, basically buying all the microchips that the world was requiring. So a number of internal and external factors affecting the supply chains. I think it's gonna take a time to recover. I was talking to experts from the HSBC headquarters in Mexico a few weeks ago, and they were basically analyzing together with the Institute for Competitiveness, the Mexican Institute for Competitiveness, this matter, and they were estimating that they would take probably more than 1 year to be back on track in terms of having all the supply chains ready to work again. I mean to basically to overcome the disruptions that these supply chains had in the past, and start working, trying to reach again the previous trend of growth of trade flows. So that's not a very optimistic view I see, but I think that that it is also a learning process. We have now the opportunity to learn from this, and basically to start working as a region with actions to basically monitor in a better fashion the different components of the supply of the sectors that are involved, that are important for the region, and also to I don't know how to put it, but it's basically to coordinate among countries to have a better preparedness strategy for this kind of situations. I mean, nobody would expect a situation in economic terms like the one we had the past months, but I think that one of the, not failures, but perhaps missing elements of an integration process like the one we have in North America is that it is only focusing on having a free trade area. I mean, in other regions of the world, we have seen different integration processes going from basically to common markets or to economic unions. And in the case of North America, NAFTA, and now the USMCA, they were clear since the beginning of the processes that we wanted only a free trade area. No, there had been voices and academic studies, basically imagining how a different integration process would be in North America beyond a free trade area. But the reality is that we don't have a broader mechanism to basically prevent and to prepare in a better fashion with other internal policies, with coordination of internal policies, or with coordination for security purposes. I mean, we have had in the past efforts by specific administrations like the Security and Prosperity Partnership, SPP, ASPAN in Spanish, and that was after the attacks in New York. And then we had something called the North American Economic Dialogue that was absent during the last administration, and unfortunately is resuming its works in Biden's administration. I think these kind of mechanisms of continuous dialogue at the highest level, bringing together governments and companies, is the right recipe to be very prepared for these kind of situations.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you touched on the subject of security. That's a very sensible subject for everybody involved. As you know, companies are striving to become CTPAT as fast as they can, and there's been slowdowns in the certification process, as you know. Even if you want to trade, if you're even an element like the carrier is not CTPAT certified, the whole chain is broken. So, from that perspective, Memo, how much or how important is this supply chain issue, or that we're having with a compromised supply chain, for national security for the U.S. and of course Canada and Mexico?
It is extremely important. We have seen one of the first actions in trade matters from Biden's administration was precisely to ask for a study, for a national study on the vulnerabilities of the supply chain of the American industries, and that study brought as a result a number of actions that need to be taken in order to be better prepared for future scarcity phenomena. And not only that study, but also the U.S. government is providing a huge budget for those for the development of stronger supply chains in the U.S. That's very positive, and that has had an impact in Mexican economy. Mexican economy is very dependent on the recovery of the U.S. economy, and in terms of the internal policies in Mexico to be very prepared to these changing scenarios with respect to supply chains. I think we are still missing a good industrial policy at the national level to basically emulate what the U.S. is doing. I think that that has an explanation, and if you allow me to give my hypothesis of these missing actions from the federal government, is the fact that as opposed to previous administrations in Mexico, international trade and development of supply chains and development of the industries in our country is not precisely the top priority of the administration. I mean, it's not that they are blocking necessarily the development of these important elements of the economy, but they don't have it as a top priority. And in terms of trade, for instance, basically what we are doing now in Mexico is like an inertial activity with respect to trade negotiations. We were basically doing what we were already doing before, but not starting new important initiatives to continue expanding our international markets. And the same happens with respect to industrial policy internally. So I think we have a very good example in what the new administration in the U.S. is doing. Perhaps we need to engage in more cooperation among North American countries to learn from the best practices, not only in North America but in other regions of the world, and try to have a more consistency in internal policies. No? I think that's a formula, and of course, enhancing in terms of international disciplines. You were mentioning CTPAT and these trade facilitation mechanisms. I think we have a long way to go in terms of how to improve the implementation of the trade facilitation provisions of our trade agreements, and that's an area of opportunity that also comes from the trade facilitation agreement that the WTO.
So there's a lot of work to be done right now between the Mexican administration, federal administration, and the U.S. federal administration, and it seems that it's not the top priority for either one of them right now. However, the market is telling you otherwise. As you know, Mexico, it was the main exporting or the main trade partner has always been the U.S., to the point where Mexican companies, especially the ones in the north, wouldn't even consider export markets Central America or South America. And there's very, glorious examples like FEMSA, that they have a huge market in Central and South America. However, it was, I guess, the inertial, as you say, the easy way, the traditional way to export to the States. But the market is changing that situation, not only for the export part, but for the import part. So right now we're starting to see more imports coming from Asia into Mexico to get value added in Mexico and then sent to the US and Canada. So what do you think the trend is going to be in the near future? Is the Mexico supply chain becoming more regionalized, or is it going to be more global now?
I think the second is the most likely scenario. I mean, we're going to be more regionally focused. We're taking advantage of the trade war between the U.S. and China. We are experiencing from the state government that I represent now, the state of Puebla. We are receiving investments coming from Asia. Not only Asian companies, but also other companies from the US even, that were originally established in China or in other Asian countries, now going back, but not to the US perhaps. Some of them are going back to Mexico, to Puebla, and they are basically establishing to be like a hub for exports to the US with a different cost structure. And that's something that we have to take advantage in Mexico. We are going to continue seeing this, because I don't think that this problematic between the US and China is going to be solved in the near future. So I think we have a window of opportunity in Mexico to capitalize that difference between those very big countries in term trades and in trade terms. And I think that is a factor that we have to consider. There is, however, a requirement that needs to be taken into account, and that is we need to be more consistent. I was mentioning this consistency problem in internal policies in Mexico, US, and Canada, because we saw that during the pandemic. I mean, we saw that when the borders were closed between the US and Mexico, for instance. Those activities declared strategic or essential was the word that they were using, were not exactly the same activities in Mexico and the US. And that brought a very problematic supply chain situation for some companies that were working both ways, both sides of the border. I mean, they were basically essentially in the US, but not essentially in Mexico.
Correct. Yeah.
But they were not able to operate in Mexico, and they were already operating in the US. There was a huge political pressure as a result of that from American companies in Mexico. I was at that time, I think, not anymore, but I was very close still to, because in the previous years, I was director of the American Chamber of Commerce in Monterrey, precisely. And I think,
Yes.
companies were extremely worried about the situation in this declaration of essential activities. There was no coordination at all defining which activities were essential, and that brought a very disruptive scenario for supply chains in North America.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can get into the labor effect that disconnection or disconnect brought. I remember the early days of COVID. It was, you had to have a specific letter specifying that you were essential and that, or that you were supplying essential industries to keep working. And it was a mess. So we'll talk about it in a little bit. But now that you were talking about the supply chain and how different approaches were happening, let me ask you something kind of specific, Memo. One of the issues that we have found right now, if you are involved in manufacturing or any kind of international supply chain situation, is the mentality that just in time was the way to go. So when the supply chain was in very good shape, you could easily predict the lead times, the manufacturing times, and the stock. You could actually minimize very precisely the inventory. But that kind of mentality kind of put us in a very precarious situation where it was extremely evident that the supply chain was very fragile. So what do you think is going to happen in the past? Are we going to start stockpiling a little bit of safety inventories? Is that going to cost the companies? What is your take on that, Memo?
I think companies will need to reorganize in that sense precisely. I mean, not necessarily stockpiling a large number of inputs and materials, but I think the just-in-time practice is going to be reviewed. And they were, as you were mentioning, very fragile to external shocks like the ones we lived in the past months. And I think now companies have to take advantage also of data that that they have available. So I think we're going to see an increased use of data analysis to basically design the best, a more optimal model that incorporates these kind of risky situations into account. And I think modeling and using of data, using of artificial intelligence to predict different scenarios with different levels of probability is going to be more important, perhaps, than saving a few bucks by reducing costs of inventories, I think.
Absolutely. You and I talked a while back about some companies reading the Toyota way of manufacturing, but they just read, the summary of the methodology, and they just said, "Oh, we need to reduce inventory." That's it, So there's so many other factors that need to go into very robust supply chain that you can do. Actually, if I understand correctly, Toyota is one of the companies that was not impacted as bad on the supply chain crunch that we're seeing globally. Now, what do you think is the next step, or in the future? What do you see in the short term for economic blocks? Is that going to strengthen? Brexit was something that kind of shook or shook up a little bit the situation in Europe of the European Union. Do you think economic blocks are going to keep strengthening, or is that a trend that is going to disappear? What's your take on that, Memo?
It's a very interesting question because I will have two answers to that. One is that, in fact, if you are aiming at reducing transaction costs, it would make sense to continue engaging in this formation of blocks, of trade blocks, because that's a way to facilitate rules, to make rules more simple. You have many many agreements with different rules. Every one of them, you start having this spaghetti ball situation that has been studied in the past. No,
Exactly.
The trend after that was basically to make it. What was the name? It was like a lasagna pan. No, to start piling up different agreements into regional ones. We had, for instance, in the case of Mexico, 3 agreements with different Central American countries, and we decided a few years later to have a single agreement with Central America, the way CAFTA does. So we were doing that for the purposes of making trade rules simpler. But at the same time, and that is from the economic perspective, but another answer to that question is also taking into consideration the political reality in today's world. I think whenever the world is in crisis, countries tend to encapsulate themselves to try to protect their essential interests. So they tend not to be more open, but to be more closed. That's something that we have seen in previous world crises in the history. But perhaps the trend, and also the Brexit was a very interesting example of another element driving that separation of blocks. Not only the fact of facing an economic crisis, but also like disenchantment for trade integration in the world. No, we saw that in Brexit. We saw that with the WTO crisis, and we are experiencing that in some other regions. No, we were talking only at the imagination level, of course, in some North American states, for instance. No, it would be better to have like a block of only northern states in the border between Mexico and the U.S. Perhaps that would be an interesting country, not to have 10 states forming a country in the middle of the U.S. and Mexico. I mean, that was speculation, of course, but I think that is fed by the trends given by other regions like the ones I mentioned in WTO.
Correct. So actually, you're explaining very well that actually this trade issue is not only economic or private sector. It's also a political, and it's also a sociological issue. So what do you think the role of the private sector, the government, and society should be, the academics, on this, on improving or strengthening or making stronger the supply chain right now? I think everybody has to play a little part, and everybody is responsible for making it happen. Not just private business, not just the government, not only the academics with ideas, think tanks, but everybody has to pitch in. So could you give me your take on that too?
I think something that we have learned during COVID times is that what is working better is collaboration instead of competition. I think collaboration has proven to be effective in these specific scenarios, and I think in the issue of strengthening supply chains, that is also the case. One very powerful tool to bring together all these actors that you were mentioning is precisely a cluster approach. This is something that is taking importance in the world. We have been studying this phenomenon of creating clusters as a tool for competitiveness, not only nationally but also internationally. Now that many countries have several clusters, industrial clusters formed, these big clusters are grouping into national cluster associations, and they start working with other national associations of clusters in other countries. I tell you this because we have been studying a lot this in Puebla, and we are in the process of creating more industrial clusters, which basically brings to reality the model of Porter from Harvard to bring together different actors, private sector, the governments, local and federal governments, academy, and civil society into a group that is formally established, and they start working on ways to improve competitiveness of that specific sector or region or product. No? So there is a new fashion, a new fashion for clusterization of economies, and I think that's the correct way to go. I think in these times of needed collaboration.
Very good. And Memo, if you don't mind, how about we start taking some of the questions from the audience? There's some very interesting questions, and thank you so much for your opinions and the information you share with us on this, fascinating subject of supply chain. One of the questions is very interesting. So how do you see the integration of the Caribbean into the North American, economic bloc, and and also in the supply chain for North America?
And that's a very good question. I have not thought a lot about this, but I think we need to explore what are the capabilities of the Caribbean countries in these supply chains. No, there has to be a very serious study to really identify sectors or activities where the Caribbean countries can be a good source of inputs for production in North America. Let's remember that there was an attempt to have a free trade area of the Americas back in the 90s. The FTAA was an initiative from the US actually that started having negotiations in Miami, then we moved to Panama, and then we moved to Puebla, where the process basically stopped after disagreements between the US and Brazil, basically. But what other factor that we saw at that time was that, that process was basically bringing together all American countries, including the Caribbean countries. And I mentioned this because at that time I was taking part of those negotiations. I was a very junior civil servant at that time, and I think one of the takeaways of that process is that Caribbean countries were not precisely ready to be part of global value chains. They were basically struggling, or still struggling back in the 90s, to be able to compete internationally with products in terms of quality, certifications, very specific needs of some industries. But that's a generalization. As I mentioned at the beginning, we need to really study that matter. I think many years have passed, and also we have now a different situation in some Caribbean countries, and I think it would be a good opportunity to explore that source. That's an interesting question. I haven't thought a lot about it.
Well, yeah, agreed. It's interesting to see how the Caribbean could actually integrate with us in North America. Now, based on that, or following that question, what do you think the strengths and weaknesses for Mexico are to take advantage of the supply chain disruption right now? Because, we're the port of Los Angeles and Oakland and most of the ports in the west coast of the United States are saturated. There's horror stories of ships waiting for days and days and days, if not weeks and weeks and weeks, to be unloaded. And a lot of that shipments are coming now to Mexico. But in addition to that positive situation where they can come through Mexico and then be distributed by land, what other advantages does Mexico have, or could take advantage of the current situation with the supply chain, Memo? And what weaknesses do you think we also have?
I think strengths are definitely our location. We have a privileged location with some facilities that have a global quality, very high quality, like some ports, but also one of the weaknesses that we have is perhaps the institutional framework to basically have a coordination among states and the federal government to really consider Mexico a logistics hub. I mean, we basically are no longer working in a coordinated manner among the states, and that makes it very difficult when you have important needs of investments on infrastructure. No, we have basically very different Mexicos within the country. No, we have a northern part which is very well developed and connected and international, and a center that is basically defining its way to go, and the southeast and of the country, and the south and southeast of the country, which is very much in a very precarious situation with respect to infrastructure. So we need to have a more a very developed policy coordination to have to really exploit the potential of Mexico as a logistic hub, and also I think one of the weaknesses is the messages that we give to investors in some cases. No, we have seen problems with respect to the energy policy in Mexico. That is not a secret. I was privileged to be the negotiator of an energy chapter in the USMCA, and we negotiated a very different chapter than the one you see in Chapter 8 now in the USMCA. I mean, it was a very interesting exercise of negotiating energy, which is essential for competitiveness of the region.
Absolutely. Yeah.
In a regional manner. I mean, we were thinking on a chapter, basically considering now that Mexico was able to be part of an energy chapter, we were negotiating a chapter for to increase competitiveness of the region with some provisions to guarantee independence of the regulator. I mean, there were a number of provisions that we were negotiating at that time. We concluded negotiations of that chapter in April 2018. And then we had the elections in Mexico in July 2018. And there was an instruction from the transition team to basically change that situation. So we need to strengthen our internal legal framework, our rule of law, our infrastructure, our institutional framework, basically to give clear messages to economic agents, to investors.
Yeah, very good, Memo. And you mentioned the existence of different Mexicos, the northern part, the central part, the southern part. Do you think there's some lessons learned from the northern states that are highly developed that can be shared with the southern part of Mexico, so we can actually create create a stronger supply chain as a whole country? What do you think we can do?
I think, yeah, there are a lot of lessons to be learned from the northern states. Also, of course, it's a different situation because it has a very different nature, and geographically speaking, the way, the mountains, and the different environments that you can find in the south and the southeast is different from the north. So the north is naturally endowed with the possibility of bringing together technology to increase productivity. That is not the case in the southern states, but nevertheless, we still have a number of lessons to learn from the experience of the industrialized states of Mexico. I hope that can be done. There is an exercise now that I am in a state government. I didn't realize before, but now there's a very solid association of states, of secretaries of economic development of the states in Mexico. It's called AMSDE. And I see a lot of potential in that collaboration. I think that's precisely as you were mentioning, that one of the angles of that collaboration can be on learning lessons about how to implement an industrial policy that works for the South. That is something that is still to be done.
Very good. Do you think, as we're speaking or talking about maybe using best practices and implementing them somewhere else. Do you think that this very visible and very hardly felt supply chain disruption is giving us a chance to kind of reevaluate how we execute the supply chain and maybe rethink how it should be done, like you said, with the use of better policies that are better coordinated and artificial intelligence to maybe optimize the processes? What do you think, Memo?
Yeah, basically three factors. Coordination at different levels, use of technology to support better decision-making processes, and of course the issue of regulatory improvement. That is a very specific task that we can perform that can bring enormous benefits in terms of competitiveness for our region. We have very different legal frameworks, regulatory frameworks in the countries. And one fashion that I like from the USMCA, for instance, is that we have several chapters now dedicated to bring together those regulations, trying to improve coherence of regulations. We have a good regulatory practice chapter, for instance, that is new, and we have also a chapter with something like 7 annexes, sectoral annexes, where the private sector, in some cases of the 3 countries, were bringing together their needs to coordination in terms of regulation, and they were proposing ways to work together in order to achieve more regulatory coherence. So those were interesting examples in the chemical sector, for instance. They had a proposal for countries that is now part of a chapter of sectoral annexes. I think that's the way to go: coordination, using the experience of companies. At the end of the day, companies are the users of these kind of instruments, of trade instruments, and we need to learn from their implementation. I see a lot of potential in these exercises of coordination among regulatory agencies, for instance.
Right. And I'm actually a fan of Chapter 26 for competitiveness. And I really like the fact that we are actually coordinating on how to be more competitive as a bloc. And that was not part of the previous NAFTA agreement, if you remember. So that's one of the, from my point of view, of course, is one of the important differences between USMCA and NAFTA. Do you think there's some others important ones besides the ones you already mentioned?
Yeah, aside from the one that you mentioned, let me tell you that the story of the competitiveness chapter is very, very, very interesting. We normally had in our preambles of FTAs always this sentence that we intend to increase competitiveness among the partners and everything. But we didn't have any single provision to do that. I mean, as a result, of course, we were expecting that making rules simpler and providing each other preferential treatment, we were going to achieve a higher competitiveness. But this is the only FTA that Mexico and the US have that contains, and Canada actually, that the 3 countries contain, the only FTA that contains a chapter on competitiveness. And the idea is to invite companies from the 3 countries and academy from the 3 countries to propose projects which are cross-cutting in nature, that are not only for one chapter or for another chapter, but that had a cross-cutting nature, and as a result, they increase competitiveness. We were talking during the negotiation of that chapter. It's a very, very, very small chapter, maybe 2 pages or something like that, but it's very powerful.
Exactly.
Because you can have a number of projects, the ones that you imagine that increase competitiveness, and that is an invitation to give life to a legal text. We were talking during negotiation about, for instance, health tourism, and the different angles of health tourism and homes, second homes for retired people. So the issues of Medicare portability, those kind of issues that cross across a number of angles of the negotiation were part of that competitiveness chapter. But what I would like to also to mention the digital trade chapter. We didn't have, of course, a digital trade chapter in NAFTA.
In NAFTA.
We didn't have e-commerce as we know it. And now that chapter is basically enhancing the growth of digital trade. The idea of the chapter is not precisely making huge changes or obligations to promote the growth of e-commerce, because e-commerce is already growing. What the chapter aims at is basically not to interfere with that growth. Basically, we're aiming at retiring the obstacles to make digital trade grow naturally. And we saw during the pandemic a spectacular growth of digital trade. And I think we have to be able to use that tool to let's say to democratize free trade. I mean, there are several regions, as I have mentioned, in the country that don't take advantage of free trade rules, but they basically live in a non-international trade environment. So we need to use the digital trade platforms to expand the benefits of trade to all regions, to all types of companies, to all sizes of companies. There's a very interesting chapter also on SMEs that we need to exploit better. To basically 90-something% of the companies in the three countries are SMEs. So we need to work with them in order to make them international SMEs and growing SMEs, successful ones.
Very good, Memo. Yeah, there's some very interesting times ahead. And to close this up, because we're running out of time, I just want to reiterate, and maybe you could expand on it. You definitely think that this supply chain disruption is going to last at least another year. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's going to last at least another year, and we're going to need creativity to overcome this situation in the next few months. I mean, I think now it's a good thing that borders are opening, and we need to basically use the mechanisms of coordination and cooperation at the regional level, like this North American economic dialogue, to propose better ways to overcome the next few months, because it's going to last. That's for sure.
Unfortunately, it's going to be our new normal, I guess, at least for a while.
Probably, yeah, probably that's the situation.
Very good. Just an interesting fact that I want to share with you, since I'm closer to Laredo. As you know, they were opening the borders yesterday for land travel, non-essential, and everybody was expecting huge lanes at the border crossings and all that stuff. Actually, that didn't happen. It was very relaxed. Everything went actually a lot smoother than everybody thought. So there will be some surprises on the next couple of months on how things will behave. Hopefully, it'll be positive surprises. Memo, I want to thank you for all the interesting information that you share with us, and I'm really looking forward to see what happens in the near future and your take on them once we go through them. Thank you so much again. I really appreciate it, Matthew. I guess the mic is yours now.
Francisco and Guillermo, thank you so much for a tremendous look at a perspective that we don't always get in Kansas City. As we were planning this program, we said we hear the U.S. American perspective a lot. I think it was super valuable tonight for us to dive into the Mexican perspective, which is very similar in a lot of ways and different in others. And Guillermo and Francisco, you both brought Such excellent insight, and we really appreciate that. We'd like to express our gratitude again to our sponsors for this series, Cyprian Simkowitz and Jerry White, as well as Nancy C. Messer, and also a particular thanks to the Greater Kansas City Foreign Trade Zone for their support of this program this evening. We do have one program remaining in this series. You can find out more information at irckc.org. And until we see you again, we hope you'll stay well. Take care.